My son handed me $168,000 in cash, and I smiled like I understood, even though I had never seen a single dollar of it before. I remember the weight of the envelope in my hands, thick and deliberate, the kind of weight that was supposed to mean security, gratitude, maybe even love, but all I felt was confusion settling quietly in my chest, because for the past 2 years I had been counting every grocery receipt, cutting my pills in half to make them last longer, and wearing the same winter coat through 2 harsh Ohio winters while my son, Daniel Collins, was out there building a life that looked nothing like mine. Anymore. Earlier that same afternoon, he had proudly shown me photos of the brand new Mercedes he had just bought for his fiancée, Ashley Bennett, a sleek silver car that probably cost more than everything I owned combined, and I had nodded, smiled, told him it was beautiful because that's what mothers do. We celebrate even when we don't quite understand where we fit in the picture. Ashley stood beside him when he handed me the envelope, her fingers resting lightly on his arm, her smile perfectly placed, the kind that never quite reached her eyes, and she didn't say a word, not when he told me it was something he'd been meaning to give me for a while, not when I hesitated just a second too long before taking it, and not when I quietly asked, "What is this for, honey?" And Daniel laughed softly like I'd missed something obvious, like I always used to miss the punchlines of his jokes when he was younger, and said, "Mom, it's yours, I sent it months ago, remember?" But I didn't remember because there was nothing to remember, no deposit, no check, no transfer, no relief in my bank account, just months of silence and careful budgeting and the growing feeling that I had somehow slipped out of my own son's life without anyone noticing. I held that envelope a little tighter as his words echoed in my mind, "Sent it months ago," and for the first time I felt something shift, not anger, not yet, but a quiet, precise awareness that something didn't line up, because Daniel had always been careful with money, methodical even. The kind of man who tracked every transaction, who built his success on details and discipline, and yet here he was, casually assuming I had received a sum large enough to change everything for me, and Ashley, standing just close enough to him, just involved enough in everything he did, watched me in a way that made the room feel smaller, like she was waiting for something, or maybe hoping I wouldn't notice anything at all. I nodded again, because that's what I had always done, kept the peace. Avoided the awkward questions, told myself I was overthinking things, but as I placed the envelope gently on the kitchen table, I couldn't ignore the simple, undeniable truth forming in the back of my mind. If Daniel believed he had already given me this money, and I had never received it, then somewhere between his intention and my reality, something or someone had quietly stepped in and changed the story, and for the first time in a very long time, I realized I needed to stop smiling and start paying attention. I did not open the envelope right away, not because I was afraid of what was inside, but because I already knew what I would not find there, and sometimes certainty is heavier than doubt, so I left it sitting on my kitchen table while the evening light faded through the blinds, casting long quiet shadows across a space that had grown too large for just one person. My house had never felt empty before, even after my husband passed, because I filled it with routines, with small habits that kept me grounded, like making coffee at exactly 7 in the morning, checking the mailbox even when I knew there would be nothing important inside, and writing down every expense in a little notebook I kept beside the refrigerator, a habit I had started when money became tight and never stopped, because numbers do not lie the way people sometimes do. That night, I sat down in my usual chair and opened the notebook, flipping through the past few months, tracing each line with my finger as if I might have somehow missed something, a deposit, a transfer, any sign of $168,000 entering my life, but the pages told the same quiet story they always had: small grocery bills, utility payments, a pharmacy receipt where I had chosen the cheaper option again, nothing more, nothing less, and certainly nothing that would explain the confidence in my son's voice when he said he had already given me that money. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling for a long moment, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, ordinary sounds that suddenly felt sharper, more deliberate, as if the house itself was waiting for me to catch up to something it already understood. Daniel had always been precise. Even as a child he would line up his toys in perfect rows, double-check his homework, ask questions until everything made sense, and that kind of man does not forget a transfer of that size, does not casually misplace a financial decision that's significant, which meant there were only 2 possibilities: either something had gone wrong in a way that no one had noticed, or someone had made sure that it went exactly as planned, just not for me. My thoughts drifted back to Ashley, to the way she had stepped so seamlessly into Daniel's life, organizing his schedule, handling calls, offering to help with things that I had never thought required help before, like paperwork, like communication with his assistant, like anything that involved details, and I remembered small moments that had seemed harmless at the time, her asking for my mailing address even though she already had it, her mentioning that she had spoken with Daniel's assistant about handling a few things on his behalf, her gentle insistence that she could make things easier for everyone, and I realized how easily I had accepted it, how willing I had been to believe that kindness was simply kindness. I stood up slowly and walked over to the table, placing my hand on the envelope, feeling its edges, its weight, and then I opened it, not with urgency, but with the same careful motion I use for everything these days, deliberate, controlled, and inside was exactly what Daniel had said, neatly stacked bills, real, undeniable, tangible, and yet somehow it only deepened the question instead of answering it, because if this was what he was giving me now in person, then what had happened to what he believed he had already sent before? I sat back down and looked at the money without touching it again, and for the first time I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had been avoiding, that this was not a mistake, not a simple misunderstanding, but a pattern, something that had been happening quietly, just out of reach, and the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that the answer was not going to come from asking questions out loud, because questions invite explanations and explanations can be shaped, softened, or redirected, but the truth, the real truth, lives in the details people forget to control. And if someone had stepped between my son and me, if someone had taken something that was meant for me and turned it into something else, then I would not find that truth by confronting them, I would find it by watching, by listening, by paying attention to the spaces between what was said and what was done. And as I closed the envelope and set it aside, I understood something with a clarity that felt almost cold. I had spent my entire life trusting the people closest to me, but now for the first time I was going to start verifying everything. I did not say anything to Daniel the next day, not when he called to ask if I had counted the money, not when he casually mentioned that Ashley had already started planning their engagement party, and certainly not when he told me again with that same easy confidence that he was glad everything had finally been taken care of, because I had already decided that whatever had happened, it had not happened by accident, and accidents do not repeat themselves so neatly over time. Instead, I told him everything was fine, that I appreciated what he had done, and I let my voice sound exactly the way it always had, warm, steady, reassuring, because the last thing I wanted was for anyone to realize that I had started paying attention. After I hung up, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the quiet street outside my house, the same street where Daniel used to ride his bike when he was 10 years old, where he would come running inside with scraped knees and stories that tumbled out faster than he could tell them, and I wondered when that boy had become a man whose life I could no longer see clearly, whose decisions now came with layers I had never needed to question before. I reached for my phone and opened my bank application again, not because I expected anything to have changed overnight, but because I needed to look at it with a different mindset, not as someone hoping for help, but as someone searching for patterns, and I began going further back than I had before, scrolling through transactions from months ago, then a year ago, then 2 years, and what I saw was not dramatic, not obvious, but it was consistent, a quiet absence where something should have been, small gaps in time where I remembered Daniel mentioning he had sent something, moments I had brushed off because I trusted him, because I trusted that if he said something had been done, then it had been done. I closed the application slowly and leaned back in my chair, letting that realization settle, because trust, once questioned, does not break loudly, it shifts, it tilts just enough to make everything else feel slightly off balance. And I knew then that I needed more than assumptions, I needed something concrete. Later that afternoon I drove to the bank, not in a rush, not with urgency, but with the same calm determination that had carried me through every difficult moment of my life. And I sat across from a young man in a pressed shirt who smiled politely and asked how he could help me, and I told him I wanted to review my account history in detail, every deposit, every incoming transfer, anything that might have been redirected or processed differently, and he nodded, tapping on his keyboard, his expression neutral, professional, until after a few minutes he paused, just slightly, the kind of pause most people would not notice, but I did. He looked up at me and said, "There are no records of any incoming transfer matching that amount or anything close to it." And I nodded as if I expected that answer, because in truth I did, but then I asked something else, something I had not planned to ask until that moment. "Can you check if there were any attempted transfers, anything that might have been canceled or rerouted?" And he hesitated again just for a second before turning back to his screen, typing a little more slowly this time, and when he spoke again his tone had changed just enough for me to hear it. There was an inquiry about your account about 18 months ago. Someone called to verify routing details, but there was no completed transaction after that. And I felt something inside me sharpen, not panic, not fear, but clarity, because I knew I had not made that call, and Daniel would not need to verify information he already had, which left only one possibility that made sense. I thanked him, stood up, and walked out of the bank into the cool afternoon air, my mind quieter than it had been in days, because uncertainty had begun to turn into direction, and as I sat in my car with my hands resting on the steering wheel, I replayed every small interaction, every polite offer of help, every moment where Ashley had inserted herself just enough to be useful without ever appearing controlling, and I understood now that whatever had been taken had not been taken in a single moment. It had been done carefully, patiently, in a way that relied on everyone else not looking too closely, and as I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, I made a decision that felt as steady as it was final. I was not going to confront her, not yet, because the truth was still unfolding, and the only way to see it clearly was to let it continue just a little longer. That evening I did something I had not done in years. I took out the old box from the back of my closet, the one I had not opened since my husband passed, and I placed it carefully on the bed as if it still carried more than just paper and photographs, because in a way it did. It carried the version of my life where everything made sense, where promises were simple and trust did not need to be questioned. I sat down beside it and lifted the lid slowly, letting the faint scent of old paper and time drift up, and I began sorting through the contents, not looking for anything specific at first, just letting my hands move, letting memories come and go without holding on to them too tightly, until I found what I knew I would eventually reach for. A folder with our financial records from years ago, neatly organized, labeled in my husband's careful handwriting, the same handwriting that used to leave little notes for me on the kitchen counter, reminders, reassurances, quiet evidence of a man who believed in taking care of the future before it arrived. I opened the folder and ran my fingers over the documents, remembering the conversations we used to have, the ones where he would sit across from me at the dining table and explain every detail, every account, every safeguard he had put in place, not because he thought I could not understand, but because he wanted me to feel secure, to know that no matter what happened, I would never be left uncertain about where I stood. He used to say, "Margaret, clarity is protection." And at the time I had smiled, thinking it was just another one of his careful habits, but now those words felt different, heavier, like something I had been given and then slowly forgotten to use. I flipped through the pages until I reached the section about account authorizations, the part that listed who had access, who could call, who could verify information, and I read each line slowly, deliberately, letting the meaning settle in, because I knew that whatever had happened recently would not exist in isolation. It would connect to something, some point where access had been granted, intentionally or not. I remembered the months after my husband passed, how overwhelming everything had felt, how many calls I had received, how many decisions I had been asked to make when I was still trying to understand what life looked like without him, and I remembered with a quiet clarity that made my chest tighten just slightly, that Ashley had been there during some of those conversations, not always directly involved but present, listening, offering to help when things became too complicated, suggesting that she could take care of certain details so I would not have to worry, and at the time it had felt like kindness, like support, like something I should be grateful for. I closed the folder for a moment and sat very still, because memory has a way of rearranging itself when you look at it from a different angle, and what once seemed like small, thoughtful gestures now began to form a pattern, not obvious, not aggressive but consistent, a steady presence in moments where information was being shared, where access was being discussed, where trust was being extended without question. I stood up and carried the folder back to the kitchen table, placing it beside the envelope that still sat unopened again, as if the two objects now belonged to the same story, and I realized that I had been looking at this situation as something recent, something that had happened within the last year or two, but the truth was quieter than that. It had been building slowly, piece by piece, in moments I had not thought were important enough to remember. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in a long time, my husband's old financial advisor, a man who had always spoken plainly, who had always valued details over assumptions, and I hesitated for just a second before pressing the call button, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that once I started asking the right questions, I would not be able to return to the comfort of not knowing. When he answered, his voice was older but still steady, and I introduced myself, explaining briefly that I needed to review some account history, some authorization records, and he listened without interrupting the way he always had, and then he said something simple, something that settled everything into place. Margaret, if someone had access, there will be a record of when and how that access was granted. And I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that sentence anchor itself in my mind, because that was what I needed, not guesses, not confrontations, but records, timelines, proof. I thanked him and ended the call. And as I looked down at the folder, at the envelope, at the quiet evidence of a life I had trusted without question, I understood that I was no longer trying to figure out if something had gone wrong. I was preparing to understand exactly how it had been done, and more importantly, who had made sure it stayed hidden. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind had already moved ahead of me, organizing thoughts the way I used to organize my kitchen drawers, quietly, precisely, without wasting motion. And I sat at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold before I took the first sip, looking at the folder and the envelope as if they were no longer just objects, but pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting for me to notice them. I called the financial advisor again, this time asking for specifics, not general reassurance, and he responded the way I remembered, with facts instead of comfort, explaining that any authorized access, any request for verification, any attempt to redirect funds would leave a trail, timestamps, call logs, signatures, digital confirmations, things that could not be erased simply because someone hoped they would not be questioned. And as he spoke, I wrote everything down in my notebook, line by line, because clarity, I reminded myself, is protection. After we ended the call, I drove back to the bank, not to repeat what I had already done, but to ask differently, to look at the same information through a narrower lens, and this time I requested a full report of any external inquiries, any calls made in my name, any changes to contact preferences or routing confirmations, and the woman who assisted me was older, more experienced, the kind of person who did not rush through explanations, and she studied the screen longer than the young man had the day before, her expression shifting just slightly before she turned it back into something neutral, and when she finally spoke, her voice was careful. There was a verified call made to your account about 18 months ago. The caller confirmed personal details correctly and requested confirmation of your mailing address and routing information, and I felt the air around me settle, not because I was surprised, but because the shape of the truth was becoming clearer. I asked her who had made the call, and she explained that the system only recorded that the verification had passed, not the identity beyond the provided information, and that was enough because I knew what that meant. It meant someone had known enough, had access to enough, to present themselves as me without hesitation. I thanked her and left again, my steps steady, my thoughts even steadier, because what had once felt like a scattered suspicion was now forming into something structured, something I could follow. When I returned home, I sat down and began writing out a timeline, starting with that call 18 months ago, then marking every moment I could remember where Daniel had mentioned sending something, every instance where Ashley had been present, involved, helpful in ways that now felt less like kindness and more like positioning. And as the timeline filled in, the pattern became impossible to ignore. She had not taken something in one bold move, she had created a path, step by step, making sure she was close enough to the information, close enough to the decisions, that when the moment came it would not look like interference, it would look like continuity. I paused for a moment and looked at the Mercedes Daniel had shown me in the photos the day before, the polished exterior, the effortless pride in his voice, and I felt a quiet connection form between that image and the empty spaces in my account history, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility that refused to be dismissed, because money does not disappear. It moves, it changes form, it shows up somewhere, even if it is not where it was intended to go. I closed my notebook and rested my hands on top of it, understanding now that I was no longer searching for whether something had been taken, but for where it had gone, and more importantly, how it had been justified, because actions like this are rarely impulsive, they are explained, rationalized, woven into a narrative that allows the person committing them to believe they are not doing anything wrong. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the same quiet street, but everything felt different now, not heavier, not darker, just clearer, as if the world had shifted slightly into focus, and I realized that the most important thing I could do next was nothing, at least not outwardly, because the moment I confronted anyone, the pattern would stop, the trail would go cold, and whatever truth was still unfolding would be carefully hidden again. Instead, I picked up my phone and sent Daniel a simple message, asking if we could all have dinner together later that week, something casual, something normal, And when he responded almost immediately, saying that Ashley would love that, I allowed myself a small quiet smile, not because I felt victorious, but because I understood something they did not. I was no longer reacting to what was happening. I was preparing to see all of it clearly, completely, and on my terms. The days leading up to dinner passed quietly, almost too quietly, as if everything had settled into a kind of calm that did not quite belong, and I let that calm remain undisturbed, moving through my routines with the same steady pace, making my coffee, checking my notebook, reviewing the timeline I had written out, each detail now fixed in place like pieces of a structure that was finally beginning to hold its shape. I did not reach out again to the bank. I did not call the advisor because I already had what I needed for now, not answers but direction, and direction is often more powerful than certainty. Instead, I focused on observation, on remembering to watch instead of react, because people reveal more in what they assume you are not paying attention to. The evening of the dinner arrived without ceremony, just another Thursday, and I prepared the table the way I always had, simple but intentional, plates aligned, glasses placed carefully, the small habits of order that had always grounded me. And when Daniel and Ashley arrived, everything appeared exactly as it should. Daniel smiling, relaxed, carrying a bottle of wine he insisted on bringing, Ashley beside him, composed, polished, her presence filling the space in a way that felt practiced rather than natural. She complimented the house, the table, the meal, her voice warm, measured, and I nodded, thanking her, letting the conversation move easily. Because ease is what allows people to forget to guard themselves. We sat down, and for a while nothing unusual happened. Daniel spoke about work, about expansion, about future plans, and Ashley added small details, organizing his thoughts into something more structured, more presentable, the way she always did. And I watched not just what they said but how they moved around each other, how often she answered before he finished, how naturally he deferred to her without noticing. At one point, Daniel mentioned the Mercedes again, laughing about how long it had taken to choose the exact model, and Ashley smiled, a small controlled expression, and said, "It was worth it though, everything came together perfectly." And the way she said it lingered just slightly longer than it needed to, as if the sentence held more meaning than the words themselves. I let a moment pass before I spoke, keeping my tone light, almost casual, and asked, "You must have had a lot to coordinate, with everything else going on at the same time?" And she looked at me, just for a fraction of a second longer than usual, before replying, "It was busy, but I handled most of it. I like keeping things organized." And Daniel nodded, agreeing without hesitation, as if that had always been the arrangement. I smiled, not because I felt reassured, but because I recognized the pattern continuing exactly as I had seen it in my timeline, her involvement framed as helpful, as necessary, as something that benefited everyone. And I realized that the truth was not going to appear in a single statement or confession. It was woven into the way she positioned herself, the way she moved quietly into spaces that were not originally hers. As the dinner continued, I asked small questions, nothing direct, nothing that would raise concern, just enough to let the conversation unfold naturally. And with each answer, each glance, each subtle shift in tone, I felt the structure becoming clearer, not in dramatic revelations, but in the accumulation of details that no longer aligned by coincidence. When the evening ended and they stood to leave, Daniel hugged me the way he always had, warm, familiar, unaware, and Ashley followed with a polite embrace, her smile still in place, her presence still composed, and I returned both gestures without hesitation, because there was no need to change anything yet. After the door closed and the house returned to its quiet state, I walked back to the table and began clearing the dishes slowly, methodically, letting the rhythm of the movement settle my thoughts. And as I placed the last plate in the sink, I understood something with complete certainty. I no longer needed to wonder if she had been involved. I needed to understand exactly how far that involvement had gone, because whatever had been taken was only part of the story. The more important part was how carefully it had been hidden. And as I turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the dim glow of the hallway, I realized that the next step was not about finding more clues. It was about confirming the ones I already had, and doing it in a way that would leave no room for denial. The next morning I did not rush into action, because rushing would have meant reacting, and I had already learned that reacting was exactly what would blur the edges of what I was beginning to see so clearly. So instead I sat at my table with my notebook open and read through the timeline again, slower this time, not looking for new information but testing the strength of what I already had, making sure each piece connected without forcing it to fit. And what I noticed now, with a steadier mind, was not just the pattern of access or the timing of that call 18 months ago. but the consistency of Ashley's presence in every critical moment, always close enough to influence, never close enough to be questioned. I reached for my phone and scrolled through old messages, emails, even calendar notes, anything that might hold a small detail I had overlooked before. And as I moved backward through time, something simple began to stand out. Not dramatic, not obvious, but repeated instances. Where Ashley had followed up on things Daniel had mentioned, messages where she would say, "I took care of that for him," or "I confirmed everything already," always phrased in a way that made it sound efficient, helpful, necessary, and I realized that what I had once seen as support had actually been a quiet replacement, a gradual shift where she positioned herself between intention and outcome. I closed the messages and sat very still, letting that understanding settle because it changed the shape of everything. This was not about a single transaction or a single moment, it was about control, about being the person who managed the flow of information so completely that no one else noticed it had been redirected. I picked up my notebook and added a new column beside the timeline, labeling it simply Ashley, and I began marking each instance where her involvement aligned with something that no longer made sense, and as the marks accumulated, the page itself began to tell a story I no longer needed to interpret. It was there, structured, undeniable, built from details that had once seemed too small to matter. By early afternoon, I knew what I needed to do next. Not to confront, not to accuse, but to confirm in a way that could not be dismissed, and that meant going beyond my own records, beyond my own memory. It meant stepping into a space where facts were documented independently of anyone's explanation. I drove to Daniel's office, not unannounced, but not with full disclosure either. I had sent him a message earlier saying I was in the area and might stop by, something casual, something that would not raise concern, and when I arrived, the building looked exactly as it always had, clean lines, glass doors, a reflection of the success he had built, and I felt a brief moment of something I could not quite name, pride perhaps, or maybe something quieter, something more distant. Inside, I was greeted by a young receptionist who smiled politely and asked who I was there to see, and when I gave Daniel's name, she checked her screen and said he was in a meeting, but then added, almost as an afterthought, that his assistant was available if I needed anything, and I nodded because that was exactly what I needed. His assistant, Mark, was someone I had met only a few times before, always professional, always precise, and when he saw me, his expression shifted slightly, recognition mixed with a hint of uncertainty. And I introduced myself again, explaining that I had a quick question about some past transactions Daniel had mentioned, something simple, something that did not sound like an investigation, and he invited me into his office, closing the door gently behind us. I sat across from him and asked, as calmly as I had asked everything else, "When Daniel sends money, does he usually handle it directly, or does someone assist with that?" And Mark hesitated, not long, but enough for me to notice before answering. He used to handle it himself, but over the past couple of years, Ashley has taken over most of those details. She coordinates with me when needed. And I nodded as if that confirmed nothing more than a routine change, but inside, the last remaining space for doubt began to close. I asked one more question just as carefully. "Do you remember anything about a transfer that was supposed to come to me about 18 months ago?" And this time he did not hesitate as long, but his answer came slower, more deliberate. "I remember preparing the documentation, but Ashley told me she would finalize everything directly. She said she had already confirmed your details." And I held his gaze for a moment, just long enough to understand that he believed what he was saying, that he had no reason to question it, because from his perspective, everything had been handled exactly as it should have been. I thanked him, stood up, and left without asking anything further, because I did not need more. I had reached the point where the pattern was no longer a possibility. It was a structure supported by independent confirmation, and as I walked out of the building into the late afternoon light, I felt something settle into place inside me, not anger, not even disappointment, but clarity, the kind that does not demand immediate action, only the right action. And as I sat in my car and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, I understood with complete certainty that the story was no longer about discovering what had happened, it was about deciding when and how to reveal it, and more importantly, making sure that when I did, there would be nothing left for anyone to explain away. That evening I did not review my notes again. I did not need to, because everything I had gathered was no longer scattered information. It had become a clear and complete structure, one that no longer required interpretation, only timing, and timing, I had learned, is what determines whether truth is dismissed or undeniable. I sat in my living room as the light outside faded, the house settling into its usual quiet rhythm. and I allowed myself a rare moment of stillness, not to reflect on what had happened but to consider what would happen next, because this was no longer about discovering anything. It was about revealing it in a way that could not be redirected, softened, or explained away. I reached for my phone and sent Daniel a simple message, asking if he and Ashley could come by again the following evening, something about wanting to go over a few details before their engagement celebration, and his reply came quickly, agreeable, unaware, exactly as I expected, and I placed the phone down without any sense of urgency because everything was already in motion. The next day passed without interruption, and by the time evening arrived, the house was prepared in the same quiet way it always was, nothing unusual, nothing that would suggest anything beyond an ordinary visit, and when they arrived, their expressions carried that same ease I had seen before, Daniel relaxed, Ashley composed, both stepping into a space they believed they understood completely. We sat together in the living room this time, not at the table, a subtle shift that made the conversation feel less formal, more open, and for a while we spoke about ordinary things, plans, timelines, details of their future, and I listened, allowing them to move comfortably through their expectations, because comfort is what allows truth to surface without resistance. After a few minutes, I stood and walked to the side table, picking up the envelope Daniel had given me, along with my notebook, and I returned to my seat without explanation, placing both items gently in front of me, and Daniel glanced at them briefly, his expression unchanged, while Ashley's eyes flickered for just a moment, a small movement, but one that did not escape my attention. I spoke calmly, the same way I had spoken through everything else, and said, "I have been reviewing some things just to make sure I understand everything correctly." And Daniel nodded, still at ease, while Ashley remained quiet, her posture steady, her expression carefully neutral. I opened the notebook and turned it toward them, not dramatically, not with accusation, just enough for the pages to be visible, lines of dates, notes, connections, and I continued, "You mentioned you had sent me money before this," and Daniel nodded again, more firmly this time. "Yes, months ago I told you that," and I let a brief silence settle before responding. "There is no record of that transfer," and the room shifted, not loudly, not suddenly, but in a way that changed the air itself, Daniel's expression tightening slightly, confusion replacing certainty, while Ashley remained still, too still, as if holding a position she had practiced. I did not raise my voice, I did not press forward, I simply continued. "There was a call made to verify my account information 18 months ago, and after that, nothing was deposited." And Daniel turned toward Ashley, just slightly, not fully, but enough to acknowledge her presence in the space between what he believed and what he was now hearing. She spoke then, her tone even controlled. "Maybe there was an error, these things happen." And I nodded once, acknowledging the possibility without accepting it. And I added, "I spoke with your assistant, Daniel." And that was the moment something changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough because Ashley's composure shifted just slightly, a fraction of a second where the certainty in her posture did not align with the calm in her voice. I did not look at her when I spoke next, I kept my attention on Daniel, because this was not about confrontation, it was about clarity. "He told me you trusted Ashley to handle those details." And Daniel's brow furrowed, the pieces beginning to move in his mind, and I let the silence remain again because silence, when placed correctly, does more than any accusation ever could. Ashley opened her mouth as if to speak but paused, and in that pause, in that single moment where explanation had not yet been formed, the truth existed without protection, without narrative, and I closed the notebook gently, resting my hands on top of it, not as a gesture of finality, but as a signal that I was no longer searching, and I said quietly, "I am not asking what happened." And then after a brief, steady breath I added, "I already know enough." And for the first time since this had begun, the balance in the room shifted completely, not because of what I had proven, but because of what I no longer needed to prove. And as I sat there, calm, still, and certain, I understood that the truth had reached the point where it could no longer be managed, only faced. Daniel did not speak right away, and that silence was different from the others. It was not controlled or intentional. It was the kind of silence that forms when something familiar begins to unravel and the mind struggles to keep it intact. And I watched him carefully, not with judgment, but with a quiet attention that I had learned to trust more than words, because in that moment, what he did not say revealed more than anything he could have tried to explain. Ashley, however, recovered first, her posture straightening slightly, her expression smoothing back into something composed. and she spoke with a measured calm that might have worked if I had not already stepped beyond the point of being persuaded. Margaret, I think there has been a misunderstanding. I was only trying to help streamline things. Daniel has been very busy. And her tone carried that same careful balance I had heard before, the one that framed every action as reasonable, necessary, even beneficial, and I let her finish without interruption because there was no need to challenge her version of events directly, not when the structure beneath it was already visible. Daniel finally turned fully toward her, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. Ashley, what is she talking about? And the question hung in the air between them, not accusatory, not yet, but searching, uncertain, and for the first time, I saw something in his expression that had been absent before, not just confusion but the beginning of doubt. Ashley exhaled softly as if steadying herself and replied, I handled some of the transfers because you asked me to. I thought it would be easier. I made sure everything was taken care of. And again the words were smooth, but now they felt thinner, less anchored, because they no longer aligned with the reality forming in front of him. I did not look at her. I kept my focus on Daniel, because this was where the truth needed to land, not as an argument between us, but as something he could see for himself, and I said calmly, the money never reached me. And I let that sentence remain simple, without elaboration, without accusation, because simplicity does not give anything to hide behind. Daniel's eyes moved from me to the notebook, then to the envelope, then back to Ashley, and I could see the shift happening in real time, the way his certainty gave way to questions he had never thought to ask before. If it did not go to Mom, he said slowly, then where did it go? And Ashley hesitated, just long enough for the answer to exist in the space before she tried to shape it. There must have been an issue with the account, maybe it was redirected or delayed. But the explanation did not carry the same confidence it might have before, because now it had to compete with something stronger than words, it had to compete with clarity. I reached for the envelope and placed it gently on the table between us, not pushing it toward him, not offering it as evidence, just letting it sit there as a quiet reminder of what he had believed and what had actually happened, and I said, You gave me this in person because you thought you had already given it to me before. And he nodded, almost automatically, his mind still trying to reconcile the two realities, and I added, That means something happened between you deciding to send it and me never receiving it. And again I stopped there, because the conclusion did not need to be spoken aloud, it was already forming in his understanding. Ashley opened her mouth again, but this time she did not speak immediately, and in that pause, in that brief moment where the explanation had not yet been constructed, the truth stood without resistance, without narrative, without protection, and Daniel saw it, not because I told him, but because there was nothing left to obscure it. He leaned back slightly, his expression no longer uncertain but shifting into something steadier, something more grounded, and he said quietly, Ashley, did you redirect the transfer? And the room felt still again, but this time it was not the calm before uncertainty. It was the stillness that follows recognition. Ashley looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time her composure did not fully return. I managed it, she said, her voice lower now, less controlled. I thought it would be better to handle it differently. And Daniel's gaze did not leave hers. Differently how? And she did not answer immediately, because now the explanation required more than generalities, it required specifics, and specifics are where intention becomes visible. I did not intervene, I did not guide the conversation because it no longer belonged to me. The truth had reached him, and he was following it on his own, and as I sat there, my hands resting calmly in my lap, I felt no need to press further, no need to demand anything, because the balance had already shifted, not through confrontation but through clarity, and as the silence settled again, I understood that everything that needed to be revealed had already begun to reveal itself, and whatever came next would no longer be shaped by assumption, but by the simple, undeniable presence of what had been done.